Imagine this. You've got two of the biggest literary stars of an era. They're living in the same city, walking the same streets, breathing the same foggy air. But when they sit down to write, the worlds they create could not be more different. Well, that's the incredible story of Alfred Lord Tennyson and Robert Browning, the two absolute titans of Victorian poetry.
So that brings us to the big question, right? How on earth does a single period in history produce two voices so completely opposite? It seems impossible. To even begin to answer that, we've got to first understand the wild, contradictory world they were living in. You see, the Victorian era was just this explosion of change. I mean, you've got steam engines, factories popping up everywhere, and these earth-shattering scientific discoveries, like Darwin's theory of evolution. It was an age of unbelievable progress, for sure. But all that rapid change, it brought this deep, gnawing anxiety. Suddenly, all the old certainties about God, about society, about your place in the world, they were all on shaky ground. And on top of that, on the surface, this was an age obsessed with strict public morality. There was a proper way to do everything. But underneath that super polished, buttoned-up exterior, people were just people. They were grappling with these incredibly complex inner lives, full of passion and doubt and desires that just did not fit into that neat little public box. So you've got this fundamental clash going on: progress versus anxiety, public appearances versus private realities. We can call this the Victorian paradox. And it's this exact paradox, this tension, that created the perfect storm for our two very, very different poets to come onto the scene. So on one side of that paradox, you have Alfred Lord Tennyson. Honestly, if you needed one person to be the poster boy for Victorian England, its ideals, its worries, its grandeur, it would be him. He was, in just about every sense, the voice of the entire nation. And Tennyson's own life really tracked this public role perfectly. The tragic death of his best friend, Arthur Hallam, was this huge turning point that inspired his famous work on grief and faith. Then, in 1850, boom, he's appointed Poet Laureate. That's basically the official poet for the whole country, a role he held right up until his death. His burial in Poet's Corner, that just sealed the deal. He was a true national icon. And his themes were the nation's themes. He was wrestling with that huge conflict between religious faith and the new science of evolution. He gave a voice to both personal and collective grief. He celebrated national heroism in poems you've definitely heard of, like The Charge of the Light Brigade. And he was all about upholding that Victorian ideal of moral order and duty. He was speaking for his time, directly to the heart of what people were thinking about. And hey, don't just take my word for it. The Poetry Foundation puts it perfectly. Tennyson wasn't just writing in his age, he pretty much was his age. His work became this giant mirror for Victorian society, reflecting back all its values, struggles, and triumphs. Okay, but if Tennyson was the public voice, the big national broadcast, then Robert Browning was the private whisper. He wasn't nearly as interested in the soul of the nation. He was completely obsessed with dissecting the mind of the individual, exploring all its dark corners and twisted motivations. Now, his secret weapon for this was a little thing called the dramatic monologue, and this device is absolutely brilliant. Here's how it works. You have one character speaking, usually to someone else in the poem who stays silent, but as they talk, trying to make themselves look good, they accidentally reveal way more about themselves, their biases, their dark secrets, their true, often ugly nature, than they ever meant to. It basically turns the reader into a detective. Let's just take his most famous poem, My Last Duchess. It kicks off with a boast, right? A powerful duke is showing off a painting of his late wife. But then comes the complaint. He says she was too friendly. She smiled at everyone. And finally, you get this absolutely chilling confession where he implies he gave commands that, stopped her smiles forever. And just like that, in a few short stanzas, the duke reveals himself as a possessive, terrifying monster, all while trying to sound perfectly calm and sophisticated. It's masterful. And that right there, that's the Browning method in a nutshell. He dives headfirst into psychological realism, exploring things like obsession and guilt. His characters are never simple heroes or villains. They're morally gray. He'll use shocking, almost grotesque imagery to show you what a character's disturbed mind looks like from the inside. And he writes in a way that sounds like real, messy, dramatic speech, not prim and proper poetry. So this massive difference in their approach, public versus private, society versus the individual, it all leads us to the core disagreement between them. And it's a huge one. What is art actually for? What's its purpose? And on this, their philosophies were polar opposites. For Tennyson, art was this beautiful, unifying force. It was meant to give us comfort, moral guidance, and connect us all by holding up society's best ideals. But for Browning, art had a totally different job. Its duty was to tell the truth, especially the difficult, messy, uncomfortable truths about what's really going on inside a person's head, no matter how ugly it gets. Tennyson even wrote a poem about this, called The Palace of Art. In it, a soul builds this gorgeous palace just for art, totally cut off from the world. But pretty soon, the soul finds that isolation empty and just unbearable. It ends up choosing to leave the perfect palace just to mourn and pray with the rest of humanity. For Tennyson, you see, art without a connection to real life is just a beautiful prison. Browning, on the other hand, gives us this absolute manifesto. For him, art's highest calling, its glory and good, is that it's the one way we have of truly speaking the truth. It's not about making you feel better, it's about revelation. So, okay, let's put them head to head. Tennyson's focus? Beauty, the soul, moral thought. Browning? He's all about character, action, psychology. Tennyson saw the artist as a moral guide for society. Browning saw the artist as a truth teller who reveals the individual. And get this, even their view on isolation was opposite. For Tennyson, it was a danger. But for Browning, it was often the very thing that gave his characters their unique and, often disturbing perspectives. Their whole approach was just worlds apart. So how do we square this? How do these two totally clashing visions come together? How did they both manage to thrive in the exact same time and place? Well, it all comes back to that Victorian paradox we talked about at the beginning. If you take one thing away from this, let it be this. Tennyson was the mirror of his age. He reflected its ideals, its anxieties, its public face, all with this beautiful, lyrical clarity. Browning, on the other hand, was the microscope. He zoomed way in, focusing on the hidden psychological specimens squirming just beneath that polished surface. And at the end of the day, you needed both of them. You needed one poet to reflect the idealized face that society wanted to show the world, and you needed another to expose the complex, often dark, and intensely human heart that was beating right underneath it all. It's only when you put them together that you get the full, paradoxical, and totally fascinating picture of the Victorian age. Which kind of leaves us with one final thought to chew on. If these two poets were writing today, right now, what would their work even look like? What public ideals and anxieties would Tennyson's mirror reflect back at us? And maybe more interestingly, what hidden, private truths about our modern minds would Browning's microscope put on display for all of us to see?